Alhamdulillah, nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome, my dear friends. I'm going to share with you a bit of my philosophical outlook and the way that I link my study of the Quran with a broader philosophical understanding of the world. And I'm going to introduce you to the concept of Transcendental Realism. You can look that up, Transcendental Realism. And in recent decades, scholarship throughout the world, and I'm not speaking about Muslim scholarship now, because there's only one scholarship, and that is the scholarship of truth in my understanding. There's no partitioning truth. Truth is one beautiful, coherent whole. Whether it is scholarship that emerges from Rome or from the Arabian world or from the Far East, it's all one truth. And so that is my outlook. And then the idea of transcendental realism is an approach to scholarship and to knowledge. It's a paradigm of knowledge that has emerged in recent decades. I do believe since the 70s. And it promises to be the solution to a world that is on the verge of chaos and perhaps might have already tipped over into the abyss of chaos. When there is chaos about what truth is, when there is confusion about what is real and not real, and by real we mean what is true and untrue, because truth is real and falsehood is unreal, and that is a generalization that I uphold. Transcendental realism is looking at what is real, but with a transcendental pre-assumption of what reality could be. So reality could be real, it could be perceivable, it could be observed, seen, touched, felt, in other words, empirically verified. That's the word we use in sciences. We use our senses, our observations, our eyes, our ears, and that is empirical verification. But transcendental realism, which is, as I say, a broad approach to scholarship and knowledge, is the assumption that reality could be both located within what is perceptible or perceivable, as well as what escapes perception. So you have the ordinary things that are real are the elements of nature, the phenomena of nature. You know, whatever you can study in nature generally admits to or allows empirical observation. But there is an aspect of the real world that escapes empirical verification. Now, where did transcendental realism come from? What was the background to the emergence of transcendental realism? And by the way, the word transcendental realism is now changed to critical realism, and so scientists will prefer using the word critical realism, and I kind of prefer the old term transcendental realism. But if you look up critical realism, you can get most of the information on critical realism. Of course, it's a general approach to knowledge. It's a knowledge paradigm. What was the background to the emergence of transcendental realism? The background to it was the dictatorship or the imposition of scientism on the world initially. So the imposition of rational empiricism on humanity by the West, by Western scholarship, going through the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, and the backlash of post-positivism. So scientism was there. It was the Western approach to knowledge. It relied on pure reason and empiricism. So whatever could be shown or could be measured could be shown to exist. Whatever could not be measured could not be shown to have existence. So whatever the West or Western scholarship, which dominated scholarship throughout the 1500s, 1600s, the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, for 4 or 5 centuries, Western scholarship, and still dominates scholarship throughout the world. And the problem with pure scientism, or pure, there's another word for it, positivism. The problem with that is that it is what mostly the Western scholar could empirically experience. So if the Western mind could not experience a particular phenomenon, whether it is in the world of nature, in psychologically, socially, because remember, scholarship covers all these fields. So if the Western scholar did not understand the social context of another society, then they could empirically not really make sense of it. And that is where the idea of Orientalism and Westernism and Eurocentrism comes from. So the problem with pure scientism or pure positivism, which was located firmly in the Western mind, was that it had a complete and utter blindness to the experience, the empirical experience of any but the Western psyche, the Western mind, the Western eye, the Western ear. And that is called today Eurocentrism. That blindness, that inability to perceive or see or view anything other than the Western experience. Now, I wrote my thesis, my doctoral thesis, on the idea of Western or Western cultural solipsism. And it is a phenomenon which I identify not as pure racism, but more as a defect in the Western mind. And I guess in any mind, if Muslim civilization was dominant, they would be restricted, the Arab would be restricted to his view of the world. And so that is the problem with pure scientism or pure empiricism, is that it does ultimately hinge on the pre-assumptions of the scientist or the investigator. Now, what happened in the 20th century is that a massive challenge arose to Western positivism, to the scientific outlook in the world. A massive challenge emerged in scholarship. And scholarship shifted. Scholarship at universities shifted from pure scientism, pure positivism, pure Western Eurocentrism in terms of making sense or doing research or understanding science and explaining science. A massive challenge arose from what we call postmodernism. So modernism is associated with the great enlightenment of Europe with Sir Isaac Newton, the great scientists, the classic Western scientists. And I'm not denying the contribution that Western positivism or Western scientism has made to the world. It has made amazing contributions to the whole Newtonian physics, the understanding of dynamics, of how objects move, optics, mathematics, in particular calculus, the calculus part of mathematics. All of these are invaluable contributions to human knowledge. But Western positivism or scientism reached its limitations in the 20th century, when those who were not at the helm or not located in the West experienced the blind spot in Western positivism. First of all, no object could be detached completely from its context. So if you're going to measure anything in an artificial way, in a laboratory, wherever, you are going to detach it from its context. And that context can affect the behavior of what you are observing. And so Western positivism was challenged on that basis, is that you cannot detach what you view, what you study under the microscope from its environment, because the environment are integrally connected to the behavior of the object that you are studying. And some of the developments that really brought about this problem was, for example, the emergence of quantum physics. You know, when people started studying quantum physics, they realized that if you try to study the electron in isolation, it's not possible, because the electron behaves in accordance with the observer. And so the electron particle behavior, not just electron but particle behavior at a quantum level, at a very, very small level, at the submicroscopic level, at the microscopic level, depends on the observer. And then very powerfully the weakness of empirism was exposed. But there was already weakness to Western positivism in the 1800s, I think, by Hume, the Scottish philosopher, and by Bishop Berkeley, who really brought up arguments that questioned the power and the truthfulness and the cogency of pure science, of pure positivistic empirical investigations. For example, Hume said that prove cause and effect. Hume said, can you prove cause and effect? Can you prove that the night causes the day, because the day follows the night? And unfortunately, his arguments were very powerful, and he threw a serious spanner in the whole idea that that is basically the root or the basis of positivist science, which is cause and effect, and you have to accept it as just a pre-accepted assumption, cause and effect. There's no way to prove it as such. Bishop Berkeley showed that the certain objects are defined by the observer, and for example, colors. We decide what green is, but green might not be green in the eyes of somebody else. We decide that what red is. And so Bishop Berkeley said that we cannot assume that when we are not there to see things that they will not be there. We can only say that because we look at them, that is when they are there. And I'm not going to go into the philosophy of Bishop Berkeley, but these challenges were already brought against Western pure positivism and scientism. Of course, the man who founded the real refutation of pure science and pure positivism was Immanuel Kant. Kant, the great German philosopher. And he's the great philosopher that is credited with rescuing science, or rescuing the scholarship, Western scholarship. But it came at a cost, because what Immanuel Kant said was that there is indeed reality, and he had to respond to Hume and to Bishop Berkeley and to a host of other philosophers who questioned science and pure empiricism, in other words, the study, laboratory, or scientific investigations. And what Immanuel Kant did was to introduce the idea of meaning making. So a very complex book called A Critique of Pure Reason, that is his great work. In his Critique of Pure Reason, he effectively shuts down the great critics of Western science, and he re-establishes the foundations of Western science. But it comes at a cost, and that cost is that Immanuel Kant introduces the idea of meaning making, the unique faculty that human beings have of meaning making, the predisposition towards some ideas and some pre-assumptions and meanings. And so he opens and allows, for example, for the idea of God, because Western science at that point, pretty much because everything was empirical, they had established atheism as an official outlook in science, because there's no way to prove empirically that God exists. And so Western science effectively established atheism in the 17 and the 1800s with as a growing phenomenon. So in other words, you still had cultural Christians as scientists. Bishop Berkeley, for example, was very much a Christian. He was a bishop. But the foundations of science became secular and atheist. And what Immanuel Kant does is that he, in allowing that the predisposition of the human mind admits to certain aspects of reality that is not measurable. And those preconditioned or pre-given human dispositions are things like space and time. So space is a uniquely predispositioned trait in human being. We differentiate. When we do measurements in science, the idea of space, compartmentalizing time, is preconditioned in the human mind. And Immanuel Kant then established the idea that there are indeed certain aspects of the real world that are really preconditioned or preconceived by the human mind. And so he rescues the idea of God, of the existence of God. And to the delight, obviously, of many a Christian and many a Muslim, because many Muslims now, you'll find videos stating that Immanuel Kant was a great noble Muslim. He was a secret Muslim. Interesting, you know. So let's just fast forward. And so the challenge to science was already then, but also the response to science was already created early on. I think Immanuel Kant lived just a crossover between the 17 and the 1800s. And so Transcendental Realism is a modern day phenomenon, but it doesn't come directly from science. What happens is, since Immanuel Kant's work, the whole idea of the human subjective element grew. The subjective human, the positioning of the observer, the importance of the observer in shaping the data, or shaping or understanding the data, grew. The power of the observer, until it reached the 20th century. And then you had postmodernism, where the observer was elevated to the prime determinant of what is scientifically real and confirmable or verifiable. So as you can see, early on the observer had no role. Then Immanuel Kant said the observer does indeed have a role to play. The human subject does have a role to play. And then the role of the human subject in establishing truth and reality from the data it culminated in the 20th century with what is called pure subjectivism, pure observism, or pure interpretivism. Difficult words, but basically these are all descriptions of postmodernity. Postmodernity is the belief that truth lies in the eye of the beholder. You create your own truth. Whatever you interpret it to be, that is what it is. When you talk about what is and what is not, you are talking about what we call in philosophy ontology. The status of being or non-being. The idea of being or to be and the absence of being or non-being is firmly in the realm of ontology. So the ontology of realism is that whatever is objectively there for everyone to see and experience. That is the ontology of scientism, is that objects, nature has an objective reality. It exists. Things exist independently of whether you see them or don't see them, because they can be established by a process of empirical verification. And so the idea of scientism is based on that we can mutually create an experiment, a laboratory setting where we could establish the existence of an object, a phenomenon independent of our own feelings and emotions, etc. The idea of empiricism, postmodernism, is that we are each a laboratory. Our mind is a laboratory. When I investigate a situation, an object, and especially in social science, because really the challenge with these philosophical positions on knowledge is not so much a problem within pure science, but it is a problem there, but it's really a problem in social science and in psychology. So let's quickly take stock of where we are. What I said was that Transcendental Realism is a recent methodology or paradigm of doing science, of reaching understanding or growing knowledge, that was the response to pure positivism or empiricism. But it didn't come directly from empiricism. Empiricism actually first was countered by the postmodernists, by the interpretivists, by those who rejected objective truth altogether and saw all truth as subjective. Right. We're still in that time. The dominant paradigm of scholarship today is postmodernism, is the idea that all knowledge is subjective, that all knowledge is in the eye of the beholder. The problem with that, of course, is that you get the phenomena of counter-rational or counter-intuitive knowledge, or knowledge that is clearly contradictory. And we know from the Quran that if it is from God, if it is truly real, it will have no contradictions. Right? The Quran says, if this Quran if this book was from any but God, it would be fraught with contradictions. And so today now you have a situation where the whole idea of gender, I'm going to pull out one example that is one of the most contemporary problems. And these are problems that Muslim scholars are also facing, not just Western scholars. So the idea of gender, because you define gender as a subjective phenomenon, it is a person's gender is really a social construct, and that is how it is explained. It is created in the minds of people. They are conditioned, they are pre-programmed to see masculine and feminine. And the idea of masculinity could be applied to any human being, whether they have female or male genitalia, biology, doesn't matter. The word masculinity is just a social construct, and femininity is a social construct. And what postmodernism does is it regards social phenomena as social constructs. So any social phenomenon, whether it is gender, whether it is race, it is all regarded as socially constructed. It is created within a social society. It is not really there. It has been reified by people. It doesn't really have reality. And so obviously for Muslim scholars find these aspects of postmodernism abhorrent or contemptible. Muslims don't know how to deal with the issue because they don't have a philosophy of knowledge, and they come with ideas of knowledge that date back 1,500 years, and they are unable to mount or to build an effective intellectual response to the challenge of postmodernism. So let me give you an example of how the Muslim scholar is in a trap. You see, the Muslim scholar wants to make a critique of, let's say, feminism or transgenderism or LGBT or gay or homosexuality. But they find themselves in a problem because what they do is they have to subscribe or admit or affirm postmodernism when it comes to the practice of Islam. You see, in Western society, Muslim scholars have had to embrace postmodern ideas for them to establish their legitimacy as a minority. You see, if you're in America and you need to defend your existence as a non-majority component of society, and Muslims are indeed a non-Western cultural component in Western society, if you need to explain and justify your existence as a Muslim community, as a non-Western social entity, then you need to support the idea of interpretivism. You need to support the idea that there isn't one truth. There is the truth of the Muslim, because that, under postmodernism, gives the Muslim community legitimacy. You see, if the Muslim community argues for one truth in America, then they will be swamped, they will be overwhelmed by non-Muslim scholarship, because non-Muslim scholarship are atheistic, are non-Islamic, or are anti-Islamic. The ideas within the Quran and within the Hadith are regarded as unreal or unsubstantiated, or without any basis. And so within a pure modern society, Islam would battle for legitimacy in a Western society. And in fact, here where I stay in this part of the world, for about 150 years, during the height of Western modernity, the height of Western science, which were the years, the 1700s and the 1600s, Islam was outlawed. Islam was outlawed in my country. So it was punishable by death if you had to admit that you were a Muslim. So the problem with a Muslim society within Western societies is that they find their legitimacy within Kantian philosophy, within postmodern scholarship. You see, and that is why the person of Ilhan Omar, this gay rights warrior, scarf-wearing, foolish person from America, is how she comes about. And now you can understand how she comes about, because she has to defend the idea of multiple truths in order for her to justify her existence as a Muslim. And that is how she justified her existence, coming through Western universities. And of course, if you're a Muslim student coming through a Western institution of study, through a Western university, you're going to feel an affinity to postmodernism, because postmodernism locates truth to the mind of the beholder. So if you're a Muslim, and then postmodernism or interpretivism justifies your existence as a social phenomenon. But now we have reached the limits of postmodernism, because now Muslim scholarship are hamstrung, because you've admitted to postmodernism to justify your own existence, you now have to face the Frankenstein, or the monster in its totality. And now you have to deal with transgenderism, with the idea that, all these let's say, for example, the idea that Satanism is a religion. You have to now put up with that idea. The idea that atheism or any crazy philosophy is real and justified and legitimate. You have to accept that. Neoliberalism, and really the only defense that the postmodernist Muslim has against the onslaught of all these satanic philosophies is really what they call in postmodernism deconstruction. They can deconstruct the challenge. So you can deconstruct Western toxic masculinity. But even when you look at the traditional way that so-called toxic masculinity is deconstructed, it brings about certain challenges to the traditional Muslim understanding. And so the idea of the man having an advantage over a woman, it's thrown into into chaos. The idea of the traditional ideas in the Sharia of Islam. So the Muslim scholar is in a very, very compromised position, for having adopted and having climbed onto the boat of postmodernism. The Muslim scholar now finds himself in a massive problem. Now, I haven't raised the issue of the pre-modern Muslim scholar, the traditionalist Muslim scholar, but I think my own position is there is a harking back. There is the response in Muslim societies is to harken back, to yearn back, to have a establishment of pre-modern Muslim scholarship. So in other words, going back to hadith, right or wrong, going back to my traditions, right or wrong. Whether it's crazy or not, we're going back to our tradition. The new world, the new ideas, the new scholarship is just simply too intimidating. It is too scary. It's making our children go off the track, and we prefer to go back to ancient Salafi, and that is the way. The word Salafist means going back to the roots, going back to the old ideas. And that is where Salafism is a response to postmodernism in Muslim scholarship. So, I'm still on Transcendental Realism. A beautiful emergence, or a beautiful development, because I firmly believe that human beings are generally always progressing. When we experience problems, it is preparing us for the next major progression within human development and in the progression of the human species. And I don't see the human species as a Muslim species. The human species are a species of humanity. And there is always going to be a core group, a small group within that greater species that will drive the species in the right direction. And there will always be a small group within that species that will push for the wrong direction. And I believe we as thoughtful people, as thinking people, are not necessarily Muslim, but we are those who want to drive humanity towards what is beautiful, wholesome, healthy, and good. So what Transcendental Realism as such a development, I believe, as a wholesome development within scholarship does, is it addresses the problem of scientism, which makes all science Eurocentric. It addresses that problem. And it addresses the problem of the madness of postmodernism. 10 people, 10 truths, and the recipe for war, in fact. Because postmodernism is going to lead the world to the Third World War. That is what postmodernism is going to do. You see, modernism led us to the first wars. It culminated in the West devouring itself because it believed that truth is objective. All truth is objective, and there's no questioning my truth. Postmodernism was a response. It said that all truth is subjective. But now you have created these silos of truth. You've created these bubbles of truth: the Muslim truth, the Christian truth, the secular truth, the Western truth, the Eastern truth, the new liberal truth, the new conservative truth. All these truths are there now. And where do you think the war between the West and Russia is? Why is that war coming about? Because it's different conceptions of truth. And so postmodernism is the philosophy that will lie behind the Third World War. And we ask Allah to protect us and to save the world from that, if possible. So, what is Transcendental Realism? Transcendental Realism is the idea that truth is truth. It has an objective existence. It is not subjective. It is not located within my mind or your mind. The same truth that exists for you is the same truth that exists for me, but with the difference that all truth, all reality does not admit to empirical verification. So what Transcendental Realism says is that there will always be an aspect of reality, and in fact, not an aspect of reality, but the major part of reality will always escape human perception. The major part of reality will always escape human understanding or human perception, not understanding. I need to make this very practical for you. You see, if you see an iceberg, if you see an iceberg in the ocean, the Titanic sails and it sees the tip of the iceberg. It never sees the iceberg. It never sees the iceberg. It will crash into the iceberg because it only assumed the tip is what exists. You see, if you only assume that the tip is all that there is, then you will be destroyed by the real iceberg, which is below the surface, which is 100 times bigger than the tip. The tip of an iceberg is only a thousandth of the real size. The real size of the iceberg is 1,000 times bigger. And so you will only, if you only operate on the idea that it is the tip of of the iceberg, that little point that sticks out above the water, is all that exists. You will be destroyed. The real truth is that there is an aspect of that iceberg, or a part of it, that exists beyond your perception. You cannot see it, but it is there. It doesn't mean it's not there because you can't see it. You will know that when the ship smashes into it and sinks to the bottom of the ocean. And that is the transcendental realist outlook on the world, is that human eyes, human ears, human senses in general only sees the tip of the iceberg of reality. And that there is an aspect, an element of reality that exists, that escapes and will forever escape our observation. Now the question comes, okay, but now what's the point? What does that help us? You know, if you say that truth is truth, it's there, but you can't see it. No. Here comes the key point in transcendental realism, is that we can make fair estimates, fair inferences on what that hidden truth is. By using our faculties of rational thinking and logical deduction, we can make a fair conclusion. We can draw a fair conclusion about what the real truth is. Now let me make an example. A guy commits a murder, right, and he leaves very little evidence, or no evidence. No evidence. So he commits he murders his wife. Let's just go for a nice, intriguing one. And he leaves no evidence. And everybody knows he murdered his wife, but you can't establish it in court because he left no fingerprints, he left no hair samples, there's no blood on him, there's no blood in there's no murder weapon, there's nothing. But yet people know it. Why? Because he was nowhere to be found on the night of the murder. He was the beneficiary to the insurance policy that this woman has. And he just had no love for her. People knew that he had an attitude that was loveless, but he left no evidence. He left no evidence. Empirically speaking, we cannot pin this murder on him. We have motive, we have opportunity, we have what is the other word? Means, but we have no evidence. What we call that is, we call it circumstantial evidence. We call it circumstantial evidence. We call it all the pointers, all the signs point to him, but there are no logical or empirical evidence. There's no blood, there's no DNA, there's no hair, there's nothing on the scene, there's no murder weapon in his, so there's no camera footage. So in other words, we have nothing empirical, but yet he's going to be found guilty in court. And that is how the courts work. The courts accept circumstantial evidence. Now, circumstantial evidence is the type of deduction that we make in transcendental realism. You have to follow me here now. In transcendental realism, we use the acceptable approach of circumstantial evidence. If it smells like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, we can make the fair assumption that it is a duck in transcendental realism. Now, does that square up with our scholarship as Muslims? And I'm going to try to conclude here and maybe have follow-up discussions. Many times in our holy texts, we will, in the Quran, right? And we will find certain verses that we have to draw inferences to. We have to study the verses, we have to look at them, but when we do an inference, we have to use the powers of circumstantial retroduction. I'm giving a tough word here, but you see, there are two forms of ration. I'll conclude with this, and we'll continue the discussion at another time. In modernism, in other words, in scientistic science, in scientism, in positivism, right? General Western science, the method that people draw deductions from is induction or deduction. So in other words, we look at the data and we draw deduction. Or induction, we input the data and we see the model that it creates, and that is inductive. So we are either involved with deductive science or inductive science. Inductive means you're setting up a hypothesis, H naught, and then you test the evidence, you test the data, and you create a model, and then you come to the conclusion that the model indeed is valid. Right? So in medical science, in health sciences, etc., that is a very common way. Transcendental realism adds to those logical methods. It deduction and induction. It adds a third one, and that is retroduction. Retroduction is looking at the context, looking at the situation, looking at the data, and formulating an explanation, postulating an explanation of reality that is hidden from view. So in other words, postulating a reality or an objective explanation that that does not necessarily tally with a detailed counting and measuring of the data. So for example, as I said, that if you add up all the evidence in the murder case, it will not lead you to the conclusion. If you're trying to use pure science, you will not get to the conclusion that the husband murdered his wife. It's impossible. You cannot draw that. In modern science, you will not be able to find the culprit because there's no evidence. But we know that the legal system has to move beyond science because it is obvious that he killed his wife. He was there, he had the attitude, so we can draw to a reasonable level of confidence. That is why the court system is not based on pure science. It is based on what is beyond reasonable doubt. It is beyond reasonable doubt. So we can establish truth beyond reasonable doubt. And that is in the Quran the idea of ma'aruf. Ma'aruf is what is generally and reasonably accepted. Right? And I'm going to conclude there and say that this methodology of transcendental realism is really, it holds the promise to unite all scholarship in the world, to move us beyond Western Eurocentric empiricism, which is blind to any other truth, like the truth that is in religions, in Eastern religion, non-physical or non-empirical experiences, human experiences. It brings that type of experience back, and the whole atheistic, secularistic outlook of Western science, it disposes of that. But it cautions or it prevents the wholesale abandonment of all objective truth. So when you say that truth is true, it is objective, but it is not always experienced or always empirically seen or felt. Then you are saying that there is an element of truth that is located beyond human perception. But if you use the science, not the science S-C-I-N-C-E, but the S-I-G-N-S, the science, you see, we then look at the science, S-I-G-N-S, of nature to draw useful conclusions about what truth is. Now, the Quran uses the word science a lot, not science, S-C-I-E-N-C-E. it uses the word signs, S-I-G-N-S, and or the signals or the clues. And the approach of the Quran is for you to observe nature, not for its science or for its empirical facts, but for the clues. And it tells us to add up all the clues and to then make a reasonable assumption. Now, the idea that God exists, for example, cannot be proven empirically, and you can try as much as you like to convince Dawkins or all these modern day atheistic crusaders about the existence of God. You will not, because they are looking for empirical evidence. If you use a postmodern explanation, yes, but then you can't convince them, because then all you are saying is that is my perception. But when you use a transcendental realist or a critical realist methodology or paradigm from which to prove that God exists, you are allowed, or it is completely reasonable to make a best case inference on how the world came about. Now, let me take the example of the creation of the world, or the origin of the world. The Western scientist points to the Big Bang theory, right? The massive explosion that started the universe from a point existence to the universe. And if we as Muslims want to uphold Western positivism, then we have to go with that. We have to then use all our knowledge of science and cosmology to build that point. But then it is impossible actually to go back to the origin of the universe. And so the atheist or the secularist, like Dawkins and his ilk, they then point to the existence of the multiverse and the existence of something from nothing, and that the universe there could be the Big Bang, multiple Big Bangs, and with an infinite recess. And yes, Muslim philosophers will counter with the original cause, the cause of all causes, the Kalam cosmological argument, but yet we will not hit the kill shot to establish God's creation of the universe. And so pure scientism or pure positivism will not allow us to establish without any question the existence of God. And neither will postmodernism, because postmodernism will only say that the atheist has his truth and you have your truth. But transcendental realism will allow us to make a fair case to the general public. You see, if Dawkins and all the other atheist cosmologists come and present their argument for the multiverse and for the something from nothing argument, which is one of the favorite arguments of modern atheism now, is that you can get something from nothing. All you have to come and say that, look, the idea that God created the Big Bang, was the master behind the emergence of the universe and the growth of the universe. All we have to do is, we have to say that on which argument is more beyond reasonable doubt. You see, we have to then not make a scientifically or a positivistic argument that is absolute and without any question, but we have to make an argument that is most appealing. That is most appealing. And that is the difference between transcendental realism and pure realism, is that we only have to make arguments that are most appealing, most intuitive to the human psyche and to the human mind. And we don't have to make arguments that are only appealing to Muslims. We have to make arguments that are appealing to all people. So I will conclude there. I think it's been going for a while now. I can't see the time, but I'm just giving an introduction to what Transcendental Realism is. And I would hope that you would go and do a bit of reading yourself now, study it, and you will have to look for critical realism, because Transcendental Realism is no longer the term that is used. But it is an approach to knowledge that I believe is driving my search for understanding and meaning in the Deen of Islam. And it is an approach to science that is comfortable with any field of science and investigation. And you as scientists, inshallah, I hope that you will maybe look into it and see how it can possibly be a paradigm of scholarship that will help you. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.